2024 meeting of the Madison Conservation Commission. Make a motion to elevate Noreen.
Seconded.
Yes. Approval of minutes of December 7th. Any comments?
Did you vote on your motion? You don't have to.
What's that?
Vote on the motion to elevate Noreen?
We did.
Oh, sorry.
Minutes, any comments? I thought it was well done.
Make a motion to approve the minutes as presented?
Second, and yes? Public comment? Any public comment?
I'm not sure this is the time to bring this up, or maybe during the talking about the master plan, but I had presented this in April about seeing the forest for the trees, which was looking at town properties and deciding if they had been designated as town properties or conservation properties. And then if they, I mean, we've always assumed they were conservation properties, but that the need for possible warrant articles to formally
Right,
designate them as conservation lands. And it's only, I think it's mostly relevant because it's who's in charge of the maintenance of the properties.
Right.
We spend conservation funds maintaining these properties, but if they're town properties, then the town is responsible for spending the funds to maintain them. So I don't know,
Well, in terms of, do you happen to have a list? I don't have it offhand as to town properties.
They're in your master plan.
in the master-
They're in the master plan.
Yeah.
Okay.
There's
So much for
18.
that. So much for that.
Well, the ones that we manage.
Right, or less, right. But there are town properties that
That we
aren't,
don't manage.
that aren't included.
But did there, I guess my question is, does there need to be a formal warrant or some sort of formal designation that they are conservation properties and not town properties? You know, it says like the town bought the land, it was bought by the town in 1929 for Blair's location, but was it ever formally designated a conservation land? That's the research that needs to be done.
And I think the reason this comes up is because we're required to have a warrant article now for the East Davis Pond property,
Right.
which is town-owned, but not managed by the Conservation Commission until the town grants us
Correct.
that permission, which
Right.
is what our attorney has said. So
Right.
the question is, how about all the other properties? And also, wasn't there a question about whether it was a town forest or not
Yes,
as well?
yes. It's the question of whether it's a town forest, conservation land, or town property.
Property, okay.
Okay, what's the benefit of us versus town property?
Well, I think
Us
it's just a-
managing it versus the town?
Well,
Is there any strategic properties that we have issues with?
No, but I would think that things like who gets the land use change tax money would be an issue. And when those properties are cut, or who is responsible for the monitoring. I mean,
Yeah.
we pay Tim to do that. I just don't know, and I don't know if old properties, like in 1929, if they're grandfathered. You know, if they just, because we've treated them as conservation properties for the whole length of time that they've been in the town possession, does that automatically make them conservation land, or does it have to be a warrant article that designates them as conservation land?
Well, is there any confusion with the list that we have that we designate as conservation
Well,
properties?
like it says, like, just started looking at the Blair's location, it says the land was bought by the town in 1929. It doesn't say anything about being a conservation land, but we've always considered it a conservation land. So I just, you know, I thought, we were going to sort of research this over the summer, I thought, and then find out, so maybe it's too late for this year, but I think it's something that needs to be on the agenda and looked into, and if the town council says we're grandfathered, we don't need to do any of this, then that's great. But it's something that in this article from Understanding New Hampshire Property Taxes, says that it needs to be done.
Okay, let's start off with, Kate, could you get a list of the town properties? And we'll review it. Okay?
Thank you.
Okay.
You mean the Madison conservation properties?
No, the town.
The town
list.
properties.
Okay.
They're not the same thing.
They're not the same thing. Yeah, I agree.
Well, that's what I'm trying to get to.
So,
Okay.
Mike, could I just ask a question then? So, what I think I'm hearing is that we should I would like to know that it's verified that these are in fact properties that the town owned and/or purchased and/or donated to, that were formally designated by the town legislative body to become managed by the Conservation Commission, the same way we're going to do with the East Davis Pond 12-acre property.
Mhm.
So we wouldn't need to look at all of the town properties. We need to verify the ones that we've been managing, which is this list of 18 properties, that they were formally designated for the Conservation
Okay.
Commission.
So you're
That's what
not,
it-
you're not concerned, I
About-
thought I heard that there are town properties that perhaps should be conservation properties. So I
Well-
heard that, so that's why I asked for the list of the town properties, was to make a determination if we had an interest in dealing with that and consulting with the selectmen.
Is that what you mean?
Well,
I
I
don't
think-
think that's what I
What I
heard.
meant was the 18 properties that we
Pretty-
have listed now,
Right.
whether some of those are designated as town properties and some of them are designated as conservation properties, but we have been managing them all as conservation properties.
Okay, Mike, how do we deal with this issue?
When that form was given out, I believe the town attorney looked at it and spoke about town forests and how that had to be at town meeting.
Okay,
In order to declare something a town forest, the town body had to vote on that. I will, before our next meeting, I'll find out what his reply to that was again. And I'll also run it by the other two selectmen to see how they want to handle town property versus conservation property.
all right, thank you very much, appreciate that. Okay, Tim is not here. Chain of Ponds update. Mike, any news?
Still fundraising. We have a grant that's due on the 12th, so next week. So we're working with Sal Minikian from the Conservation Fund to put that together. We're hoping to get $400,000 from the Community Forest Program to the National U.S. Forest Service. That would fill a void created by the Drinking Water Groundwater Trust Fund grant we didn't get, and would likely be a better fit, frankly, for what we're trying to accomplish at Chain of Ponds.
Okay,
So that's tracking, and we're optimistic that we'll be successful on that. Sally has applied for a half dozen community forest grants in the past and done very well, so we have our expertise in that. Grant writing is an 8-page open, just like kind of narrative. So it's a good one, good lift. We're working on, before the holidays, we flew the property with a drone with the assistance of Joe Klementovich, local videographer, storyteller, and we're putting together a 1.5-minute video with a narrative that talks about the project. And we're going to use that for promoting it through the coming year as we kind of become more visible on the community fundraising front. After a meeting last month, I sent along the template for the conservation easement, which I hope was helpful in kind of framing how, and just kind of that template, or maybe a starting point for conversations around how that easement might start to look. I also provided that letter that was requested related to the request for funds.
right.
And I did take a look at the appraisal. You had mentioned, had a question about the timber value as it related to the overall valuation of the property. It's hard to discern exactly. So one of the things about appraisals, right, there's different tiers of appraisal, and restricted reports are kind of that middle of the road where we don't get a lot of the nitty-gritty details of the appraiser from the appraiser on how he kind of formulated his opinion of value. So it's hard to fully for me to explain how he came to his evaluation. But I can say at least that because we use a conservation easement template that was probably the most permissive that you could have as a kind of a starting point for him to do his conservation value appraisal, we know that the value of the conservation value can only go up. So basically, you noted things in that conservation easement, like it mentions things about agricultural use, and there's some mention there about retained rights around mineral extraction, both things that we would not want to see in the easement. I think you don't want to see either. But by removing those, we actually would increase or decrease the after value of the appraisal. So our conservation value, and the value in between that we're using to kind of inform our ask to the town, can only get bigger. So we know at a baseline that our number is the lowest it possibly could be.
Okay, that brings up, I believe we had the conversation about timber after the meeting, so I'll clarify what we talked about. Question I had was, there was $200,000, whatever the number is, like $200,000 of standing wood. If they timbered that off, the $200,000, could we allocate that against the easement, or a good portion of it against the easement, because the easement controls, in effect, the timbering of the area. And so I proposed that question. So there is no answer of that at this point, but essentially I was trying to get the 455 value down to something closer to our value. So that if there was that $200,000, that basically goes away in terms of a premium that we are not paying. So that was the point of the question. So.
Yeah, but in reality, it's, at the end of the day, it's the land trust has the latitude to say, we recognize the conservation value is $455,000, but we're only going to ask the town for, I think it's at 213, based upon what you indicated was available to support the project. So, and in essence, in some ways, I think it's positive in that we can communicate to the community that the town is actually getting a bargain, if you will, for the value of the easement.
The only point of this whole logic was that we weren't getting the deal. So in other words, that the rest of the constituents weren't giving up 200,000 plus to incorporate the easement. So it was just a matter of philosophy. Whether or not it makes any sense or not is the issue, but I was trying to get it to the point that we had a fair deal.
I think you have a very fair deal.
Very fair deal,
yeah.
but in terms of as far as value proposition.
Yeah, and I also think it's important. I think the conservation easement has kind of created a dynamic where it's like, it's created a bit of a transactional relationship, or it feels that way between the town and the land trust. And I really think that it's important that we kind of reframe the conversation around this is hopefully a partnership, and that we're collaborating, and that the town's investment in supporting this project, which is critical for us to succeed, is really the value, right, from the investment, and that the conservation easement granting is really a value add. It's really just partly because we want to be a partner with the town. We want that kind of relationship to exist, where the town has that is managing that side of the conservation of the property.
Okay, you sent an email on December 8th And there's a paragraph that I'd like to just mention, and it's referring to that end, I want to advocate that the town strongly consider moving ahead sooner than later with holding a hearing and formally allocating funds to the Chain of Ponds project to help ensure that other grant makers, such as the U.S. Forest Service Community Forest Grant Program, didn't similarly reduce the project's scoring due to the town not fully investing in the project. Okay, so there is an issue I believe that we ought to talk about in terms of the timing. A couple of issues, one being that the project isn't fully funded. So the risk issue is, will it actually happen as a result of funding or lack of funding? So I'm not sure that we want to have a hearing before there is some solidity to the project going forward. I'm sure there is a lot of initiatives, and I'm sure that there's a probability, but there's a probability that it won't happen. So that is one eventuality. The other is, if we're going to have a hearing, we should have an understanding about the easement. So that we should do some work on the easement. That would involve dealing with the town attorney on matters that are in the easement document. Now, I've read, and I'm sure everybody has read this document and studied it. Yes.
Read it.
Okay. So the issue is that there are a lot of good things in this. There's a lot of questions.
Okay.
And I've got a list of them. I'm not going to go through all of them because I think we can deal with it. There's structural issues in references that don't exist. So you've got section E3, 3E, and it doesn't exist. There are a whole bunch of them like that.
Okay.
So it looks like this was extracted from another document that had other provisions in it. So, and it's throughout the document that there are references that aren't proper.
Sure.
There's one in, I think it's in section 3 or 4 that says, refer to section 2 something or other below.
Right.
And it's, so all of that doesn't help in terms of what is extracted from other documents and put into this. So it's an issue where I was reading it and trying to look for the references that you were going through. So that's,
Well, I'll say this, like, that is a template we have on the shelf, and as we typically when we draft an easement, we use that as the starting
Okay.
point, and any references get kind of worked through as we're drafting the easement.
Okay.
And so really, it's most important is the restrictions contained within, and then we adjust references based upon how the
Okay.
document gets drafted.
in conservation attributes, and that's section 1B. It says there's a baseline documentation report.
Well, that gets created.
Right, but it indicates a survey.
And we're working on that.
Right.
Yeah.
So, as far as I know, the survey is provided for in the list of all the items that are required. So that is an issue as to whether or not we know what the survey bounds are and all of that. There's a lot of issues in terms of permit. I got tons of stuff here, but I'll give you an illustration. I think it's in section 8 about minerals. There is, in this subsection of it, it describes remediation for mineral extraction.
Right, and that's what I was.
Which it says at the beginning, says there's no mineral extraction. Then you have a section that says there is.
Well, again, this is a template that is meant to apply to a broad range of properties.
Well,
And
you know, I mean, in
what
terms of.
This is meant to be given to an attorney, and you work through it to determine what rights you want to retain and what rights you want to extinguish. And so the template is just that. It has no
Okay.
bearing actually on the actual conditions on the ground for that particular property.
All right, but that means that there is a sizable amount of work that needs to be done to this draft for us to even consider it,
Yeah, I wouldn't call it a draft.
No, it's not a draft. It's
whatever it
just a-
is. I don't know what it, but you supplied it to us.
Right.
So,
Just as an example.
It's a starting point for again,
A
like,
conversation.
It's a conversation starting point to say like, oh, we don't want to include these sorts of provisions, we remove those. You may have sections, when we draft easements with our attorney, our sections move around all the time.
Mhm.
And so this is just a starting point to facilitate that discussion. And so it really shouldn't be seen as a draft, it really shouldn't be seen as anything but a framework for how the.
well, what do we use it for then?
Well, it would be given as an example to your attorney to begin the drafting of the easement, to identify things you want to keep and not keep. It has enough has the legal framework of an easement, which allowed our appraiser to say that they could look at the different rights that be extinguished or granted and come up with a value based upon what a conservation easement recorded on the land might look like. And it's permissive intentionally in that sense that because we haven't gone through the dance of figuring out what the right balance is for reserved rights versus restrictions. And so by keeping it permissive, that ensures that the valuation by the appraiser is the most conservative value possible. If the more things we take out of the easement, or the more rights we remove, the more valuable that easement becomes. And so that is, in essence, the point.
Okay. Well, there's a lot of points in here. For example, vehicles
Mhm.
that are permitted on the property, snowmobiles, even light vehicles. Do we want to have that kind of traffic on the property? There's camping, but there's no latrine or whatever. That's described that there is no facility there. There is discussion about access to water and whether or not we would install a well or a pump or whatever. And so it's like there's a lot of issues in this thing that I didn't even think of as being something that we really have to grapple with. But one of the things that maybe this stimulates is the fact that we really need to go through this and say what we don't want. So how about if I put together a list of what you say is permissible in this and circulate it?
I would like to propose maybe a little task force, like 1 or 2 or 3 of the Conservation Commission working in a small work group to come up with, because I don't see them necessarily, or I wouldn't call them issues, I would call them rights and agreements that the town comes with in partnership with USVLT to allow or disallow on the property. And like on page 24 and 23, the permitted low impact uses are he kind of outlines a bunch of those. Do we want hunting? Do we want vehicles? Do we want camping? Those kinds of things were listed on those pages. And so we need to discuss each one of those. Is that something that we as a town, would agree with, that could be permitted or not?
Well,
So,
as far as a point going forward, I made the suggestion to provide you guys with a list. Why can't we have the next meeting, have a discussion on what we
Sure.
want from this, rather than have a task
We'd like to
force
do
and all that?
okay.
And that would be a good starting point. And if I miss something,
Mhm.
you or somebody else could
Okay.
make that discussion.
Okay, I'd like to do that.
The point is that it's a matter of timing as to when we engage a lawyer on this thing. And I'd like to make some headway with respect to what structure we really think is important in this document.
So I have another point, another thing that I would like to bring up in addition to that. I missed the last meeting, but you came out with an expenses document. And when it all comes together and the town accepts responsibility for the easement, there are things in your project that I'm wondering if the town gets some of, because, for example, we are going to have legal fees to exercise the conservation easement. We are going to have monitoring fees and perhaps even enforcement fees. We are going to be responsible for the long-term stewardship of the property. Are some of these pieces of the proposal in your expense listings, would they be coming to the town to be put into a special account to administer responsibility for the easement?
Absolutely, yeah, the $10,000 line there for
Yeah.
monitoring, that would be going to the town.
Okay, what about the long-term stewardship endowment?
That goes to the land trust.
That goes to the land
And
trust.
Just to clarify the relationship with the conservation easement,
Okay,
the Upper Saco Valley Land Trust will be the fee owner of the property.
right.
We'll be responsible for day-to-day management of the property once we close on the acquisition. So any sort of like investment in improvements, day-to-day, just visiting of the property, whatever we need to do, gates, whatever we have to do, if we have to address trespass.
Right,
Um,
right.
The responsibility of the town, under the framework of a conservation easement, would be yearly monitoring and making sure that
Right.
we're adhering to the provisions, basically making sure that we're not going beyond what's allowed by the conservation easement. Beyond that, the town doesn't have any sort of management responsibility on the land.
No, but financial responsibilities, even, and certainly legal responsibilities if things don't go well. I
Right.
mean,
It's covered in the agreement. The issue about recovery of costs for issues related to.
only if we're
Yeah.
right. But
But
if we challenge
Yeah.
something,
Right.
but we're going to have legal responsibilities just in executing the conservation easement. So does that $3,000 line go to the town also?
No, that's our costs.
So we are going to incur costs.
Absolutely.
That's what I want to point out to everybody here.
Well, that's why I'm talking about the schedule for the lawyer in terms of us incurring costs associated with the review and establishing the easement. I would like to have a special meeting at a point where we're able to say, we have an agreement on an easement and what the terms of the easement is. And also, there's a high probability that this will happen, that the transaction will take place. So, the question is, when do we start incurring costs associated with this thing? So the suggestion I made is I'll make a list of things that I think are questionable issues. There's also issues around subdivision and all sorts of things in this thing that are questionable as to whether or not they make any sense.
Well,
For us.
This is I hate to jump in here, but this is like a massive template. And no offense intended, but there could be a lot of stuff in here that doesn't apply. It's up to
Well-
us. I think you're going down the right road. You've got a list, Noreen's got a list. Let's get together next month. You bring up your points, you get it to us, get it to Kate ahead of time so she can get it to everybody else. We look at it, I think we need to pare this down, or at least make notations of what we think should be pared down. And maybe shoot it back, see what they think, before we even send it to a lawyer, because
Right.
as long as we're just going back and forth, other than our time, which is always worthless, we're not costing the town any money.
Right.
Right.
So if we can pare away some of the,
Yes.
in a,
Well, just random.
the
But not a legalese and.
Well, that's
Random
not,
provisions.
legalese has to stay as
Yeah.
much as we might like to cut it all out. But it's not really legalese, it's just
Stuff.
in no inappropriate or
Oh,
not appropriate to the current situation.
Would not
Sure.
apply.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, you know, I would fully, like you brought up things like camping, you know, we're not looking to create camping on the land. Again, these are just things that, when we start a project, this is the template we start with, right? And then we work with the landowner to say, what are your goals and what are your values for the property? And sometimes they might want camping, so we have that provision in there so that we can work through
So
that.
I just think we take a collective red pen to what we
right.
That'd be great.
don't like, shoot it back to them. They either can agree with our red pen, disagree, we have conversation. And then
Okay.
once we get it to more refined, that's when the collective lawyers get involved and we make sure that,
Okay. All right.
I don't think we want to send a raw document like this to a lawyer because
No.
we
Until
don't
we-
want to pay
not
them
till-
to edit stuff we can do ourselves.
Right, not until we know what we want.
Yes.
In the initial talking about the chain of ponds a couple of years ago, I think I said that the town would have input as to the uses on the uses of the property if we had the easement. So I don't know if down the road, after this document is refined, if you want to have a public hearing just to go over the uses of the property to the town so that they can have some input, since I had made those statements early on. I mean, it might be general enough that it's not necessary for public input, but I did say when we started this project that town would have input as to the uses of the property.
And I'll note that we have some obligations, because we used LCHIP, we have an LCHIP grant, we have to allow hunting, which I'm in favor of.
Trapping is included as well?
I would have to look.
Traffic was in there.
I would have to look what the state requires on that front. But there are certain obligations from the grant maker at the state level for some of the permitted uses, for sure. And, but yeah, that's all part of the back and forth, and I think that's a great idea, just redline it. And there may be things that, like, I don't know, you're referring to the subdivision piece, but usually there's a provision where it doesn't allow for subdivision, and that may be a legal obligation that we have to keep in there. So it might have to do if there's questionable things, we may have to go to our attorney and say, can we take this out, can we keep it?
Right.
But we certainly welcome an initial kind of first
Okay.
pass.
Well, at least this stimulated a conversation. It's a, all right. Okay, moving along.
I still think there is a question of timing with public engagement and formally allocating funds. If we're waiting until, easements take a while to draft, and if we're waiting for a finalized version of the easement before we hold a public hearing, that may put the project in peril, frankly. And when it comes to being concerned about investing in the project, again, like, why would if the town isn't willing to make the leap to support the project, then why would a large grant maker? And that's what we heard from Drinking Water, Groundwater. It said, why the town hasn't invested in this, why are we investing in it? And so I think if the town sees the value, there needs to be kind of that kind of action taken to kind of show that value. And I think there's also, we have grant, like for instance, we have the LCHIP grant, right? If we don't close on the property by 2025 or something like 2026 perhaps it is, that money goes away. There are things there are guardrails. So you can allocate the funds and approve the funds, but you don't release them until we're in a position where we can close. That's a way you can safeguard. You can say we're going to support this project. The town's going to vote to allocate those funds, but you're not going to write us a check the next day.
So now it's, instead of an intent, it's a promise, and it's a promise from the town agreeing
Correct.
that we've done the right thing.
That you are obligating the funds
I'm obligated.
with assuming the
And
project.
this amount,
Yeah, that's my only suggestion.
okay.
Ralph, one of the three categories that Drinking Water Underground Trust put in for not approving their grant was that the size of the population served was not proportionate to the amount of funding requested. That's never gonna change.
Well, that's for drinking water and people having access to drinking water. So there's only one little area that I think is services for drinking water. So I think they made the right decision because there aren't that many constituents for drinking water.
Right.
So what they told us,
I don't think it affects any other issue, any other
right,
person.
if we
Maybe-
wanted to go back to drinking water, they've encouraged us to do so, but basically with a smaller ask. But we're not intending to do that unless we have to. That's
Right.
why we're going for this different grant maker.
Right.
So when does this need to happen? The town's,
You know, again, it's like, all I can say is that it's better to put the wheels in motion and have
Okay.
a plan to make it happen. I can't say, sooner is better than later, that's all I can really
All
tell
right.
you.
I'm going to suggest this, that we proceed with looking for coming to a position on our suggestions for the easement.
Okay.
We make some progress on the easement to the point that we're of the mind to engage an attorney. And if we have some understanding at that point, let's consider the public hearing. Okay?
Sounds great.
I'm not gonna make that as a motion, it's just a suggestion at this point.
I would say too, if you have the ability to, well, I don't know, I don't know how your workflows work, but if you have the ability to provide those red line edits prior to the next meeting, that would allow me to come to the meeting with kind of with a response, I suppose, in terms of keeping the ball rolling.
Well, we'll give you the list,
Yeah.
basically.
Yeah.
Okay?
Okay.
Before we discuss it,
No.
Yeah.
I would say we should discuss it amongst the Conservation Commission. I mean, we can give it to him, but I think everybody needs to have a say before we talk to USVLT about our position.
It's not a position, it's just merely a list of issues.
But it's
And if-
just your list. I'm sorry, I'm just
Well,
trying to,
I'm inviting others to make comments. It's not my list.
we
It will
would make
be-
comments
I said I would provide a list, which gives you the opportunity to review it and add, make any suggestions you want,
at the next meeting.
even before.
Well, then, what we still would have to come together to determine. So suppose Mike says, I absolutely don't want hunting, and Mike here says, I absolutely agree we should have it. We need to sort of come to
All right,
grips with
We'll
what
provide the
what it
list
is.
at the meeting.
Okay.
All right, thank you.
Okay.
I was only trying to help move the thing along.
I understand. I'm not,
Well-
I think that's great, but I think we all need to have an
Okay.
opportunity
All right.
to express our opinions
Okay,
and inputs.
all right. Okay. Master plan. I met my commitment for January. So, it's a first pass. There are things I know are missing, like maps and that, and other things. So I'm looking for help in terms of comments and for additions and changes. The red that's there is text that I've changed. I don't like using the Microsoft tracking. I find it very difficult to deal with. So there have been some extractions, deletions, from the original, the 2010 document. You don't have visibility on it as to that. However, I think most of the changes are most of the extractions are minimal, and also to make it more consistent. Some of the red replaced some of the deletions. So I'm looking for comments, and if you'd send them on to me, I'll come up with another draft.
So, could I make a
Sure.
comment? Okay, so I provided some inputs.
You did?
I understand Emily Bass provided some inputs. And
Yes?
did you get inputs from Marcia? You got inputs
Yes.
from Marcia?
Yes?
And so I would like to know that other people got to read my inputs because some of my inputs weren't included.
Some of them were.
And like the stream crossing modernization program, I thought, to me, it seems like that should be incorporated because it is something that could be coming up for flood prevention and you know, that sort of thing. To me, it's kind of like an education document for people who are coming to our town, who are reading about conservation and preservation. Also, I added some additional information about wildlife action planning, which I know we haven't spent very much time on yet, but we do have maps of highest ranked habitat. So I was just wondering, and also I had more information about what residents can do to protect our waters and rivers from salt, because that's becoming a big issue in what we're finding in water testing. So I'm just wondering how do we share or how do we incorporate what folks are suggesting?
Well, some of them, like the crossing of the water bodies and all that, we haven't done anything on. And there were issues where we haven't done anything on it, and we aren't expending any effort whatsoever to do anything on it. I said, let's try and make this document something that we accomplished, something that we're dealing with. In terms of saying, we think we're going to do something about stream crossings. I'm going like, well, if we intend to do that, let's make sure that it's reflected in this. But some of these are ideas as opposed to real action items. You mentioned the Blankenstein property. Nothing has happened on that. Absolutely nothing.
It is, it will be.
Yeah, but our involvement in that is zero.
But a master plan is to work towards the future, to look into
Right, but
new
in terms of
areas.
an action item that we have on the table with respect to that is nothing.
As far as I'm concerned, for stream crossings, we have an action item. We proposed a letter of support for a very large grant for a 13-town project. That's big.
But in terms of is it reality? Are we doing anything on it? That was the thing that I was trying to get to in this thing was, let's delete stuff that doesn't really represent an action item.
I'm not
If we
talking
send a
about
letter to
deleting.
somebody, do we really want to spend a paragraph talking about it?
I do. I'm
All
sorry.
right.
I guess
Okay.
if nobody else does, I guess I'm a lone person
Okay.
here. But we do want to make sure that people understand that salt is impacting our water and that there are things they can do to minimize their salt use. We do have a wildlife action plan. We do have lands that perhaps we should be looking at to make sure that we have corridors opened up, or perhaps if a property becomes available, that we have, that we're looking at it.
I did mention salt with respect to brine. I thought that was significant because we made a...
We're not doing the brining. That was incorrect.
We are.
No, we're not. Correct?
We're doing there's a added salt that they're adding to the sand, which I believe, in their application. Now, it's not the brine
It's not brining.
that-
Okay, so I'll eliminate the brining.
Well,
But we made a contribution.
we did, but it's not working.
Okay. I didn't know that. All right, so why don't you send your comments again and we'll have another pass at it.
Yeah.
Some of the maps that you had, if you would identify what they're about, would be helpful, so we could include that. digitizing property town reports. I guess as soon as we have all of the updates, we'll start that process. Okay, new business, you have an update, Kate?
Yes, the warrant articles. So, hold on one second. So, I reached out to town council because there was a question on the article of changing it from the language, capital reserve fund for land acquisition or conservation purposes. I will read you what I have. This is from our attorney, that this is his idea on this. Changing the purpose of the capital reserve fund requires a 2/3 vote of the town meeting, as set forth in RSA 356:16. However, I'm not sure why there is a perceived need for the change. The existing statement of purpose, land acquisition and conservation purposes, is certainly broad enough to indicate acquisition of conservation easements. If the town meeting wants to authorize an expenditure from the fund to purchase a conservation easement, it can already do that. In fact, the proposed change would seem to narrow the permissible use of the fund, because currently it can be used for other conservation purposes. The proposed change seems to allow it to be used only to acquire land or easements. Maybe the intent to narrow the purpose, but I suspect not. If people do feel the need to change the purpose of the fund, this should be in a separate warrant article. They can't just appropriate $5,000 into an existing fund while calling it by a different name. There would be need to an article to the following effect: to change the purpose of the capital reserve fund established in 2006 for the purpose of land acquisition and conservation purposes. The new purpose of the fund shall be for land acquisition or easement acquisition. If that passes by a 2/3 vote, then they can vote on a separate article to appropriate $5,000 to the fund.
All right. Any issue with that?
Well, what he's saying is that
It sounds like what
There's
he's
no
saying
need to
is we
change
don't
it.
need to do anything.
Leave it
Right.
alone.
if you change it, you narrow the scope of what you can use that
Right.
account for.
Right.
All right, so we don't have to do anything.
No.
All right. All right, Mike, your report?
I thought you were gonna steal my warrant article on Davis Pond.
No, I
Um,
didn't.
Is that all the new
I
new
can.
business?
There's other new business in here?
I had one at least. Matt Howe of Green Mountain Conservation Group would like to come to the meeting. The survey has been completed for the Blankenstein property, and we had made a motion several meetings ago to provide them a $7,000
Right.
assistance.
Right.
So he would like to come and make that presentation to the Conservation Commission to secure that. I guess we need a public hearing, so we have to plan that also, or at least have that at one of our next meetings.
Do you want them on the agenda next meeting?
For February, yes,
Okay.
I'll let him know to come to the
Okay.
February meeting.
Which fund would that come from?
Well, I think it
It's-
was the land use change tax, but we may have to ask to have it come out of the capital reserve
Right.
as a participant for that purchase. And he'll bring the budget for that project with him
Okay.
at that time.
Okay.
And then I have one other request, and that is on page, in the template that USVLT proposed, there was a very interesting section on forestry and best management practices. And I wondered if we might consider looking at that to ask for the McNair. It started on page 10 of that easement template. And it seemed like that one section on page 10 was very applicable and very general. it talks about definition of forestry, commercial forestry, best management practices for commercial forestry, limits on clear cutting, high grading, and just that one section seemed very appropriate for something that perhaps Lori Corin, and just ask her if that section or talk about it at the next meeting if you want, and I can just wait on that, but that section seemed appropriate to be that which we might just ask if we could amend to the near east, just on the forestry piece. It doesn't talk about setbacks for water, things of that sort, which I think people objected to. It's just on the forestry about clear cutting and not doing the high grading prohibited, because that easement right now, that 1972 and 76 easement is very loosely written, and does not deal with the technology of forestry today, which is the reason I would suggest that.
Okay. The section you're talking about is interesting in that it has references that there is recommended voluntary forest management practices in New Hampshire, which I'm sure doesn't mean anything if it's voluntary. New Hampshire best management practices for erosion control and timber harvesting operations, dated on December 2010 and 2016. So it's a matter of,
Those documents.
so it may include all the setbacks that we're talking about, and that was the point that was interesting to me, was that we had incorporated setbacks against the water, shorelines, and whether or not that should be included in this document or not. And so I'm not familiar with either one of these two documents.
They're online. So maybe this is a bit much, but it's kind of when I read it, it seemed to me that it was something that was a little more simplified than what we had originally proposed for the near easement.
Let's get those. Let's review the two documents that are referred in there. And see when I get to that. Okay, Mike.
There will be a warrant article for the Davis Pond property to change classification from town property to conservation property. Other than that, this bouncing around from meeting to meeting, kind of stand still here, but I believe that covered it. If there's something else, certainly answer questions.
Okay. Would you make sure that the selectmen are up for a public hearing? I'm sure they are. I don't think it's ever been discussed, at least we haven't got invitation.
I will bring it up Tuesday.
All right.
We met last night. We a boundary line adjustment that we postponed for another month, and talked about starting chapter 1 of the master plan. The update on the master plan. Pretty quiet. All right. 50 minutes.
Okay. Good. All right. As far as account balances, we're operating off of.
I don't see December statement.
So with that, I'll make a motion to adjourn.
Second.
Yes.
That's not business wise. I do want to throw out this idea to the commissioners who are here and those that aren't, and selectmen. If you're interested, we want to be, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with the property, but if you'd like to schedule a walkabout at Chain of Ponds, I think it could be beneficial to everybody that's kind of involved in the project. We talk about kind of, I mean, questions that might come up, and what and kind of what we're seeing as goals as landowners, and hopefully just kind of keep kind of building that rapport and opportunity to kind of collaborate. So if there's interest in the next month or so, it'd be great maybe to find the time to get together.
With snowshoes, perhaps.
Well, we hope so. But right now, we could go out there and sneakers. But you know, the forecast, it looks like the storm after this one is going to wash all the snow away. So,
Well, we've done it twice, so everybody's welcome to do that.
and I could send if you want to try to coordinate, or I can send.
I can send out an email to everybody and see
Yeah.
who wants to, and then
Yeah.
let you know.
Because I think there's a lot more than what we walked that day with drinking water. One of the things that Lorraine and I were talking about when I first got here is realization that the northwest parcel hosts a height of land that affords views, the Sandwich Range, Kearsarge North to Cranmore, south to Silver Lake is kind of mind-blowing in a lot of ways. And then coupled with the all the wetlands, I think it just could be a good opportunity to kind of just get together and kind of appreciate the property we're all trying to work together to protect.
Well, this is just,
We need a motion, no one's made the motion.
You did, the second.
Oh.
I'll make motion.
Nobody voted.
Okay, so
so I'm wondering if we should think about, or the Conservation Commission should think about some kind of campaign, information campaign that should go out to educate people about the reasons for conserving the Chamber ponds, or doing a mailing to the people who live around the lake, and ask them maybe to, I don't know, set up a website or something where they could have input, so there wasn't just the little microcosm of people that would come to a meeting here, but that it would be a larger venue of people who would have say as to input on in the public hearing. I don't know exactly how to go about that, and Upper Sacramento may have an idea of how to reach out, but I think we need to advertise and promote to get the acceptance at the town meeting. Yeah, that's perfect, but they should, if this is gonna happen sooner rather than later, then these lawyers need to go out and have some, I think we can make it some simple that people could just go online and click a box saying that they approve or whatever, that it would give us more of an overall feeling of the larger population as to the conservation of the council.
Right, well, the town has a website. That information,
I don't know how we'll go, but I just think we should have